Chapter 2 of The Lucky Devil, as read by Craig A. Woodward. What follows is an excerpt made for frivolous reasons. I hope you enjoy. Chapter 2. A Crimson Harpy and Silver Stone. Split. Water was cold. You knew that when you spent your life at sea. You got used to the spray and splash. But submerged was different. When it rushed over your head and covered your eyes so all was black in between gasps of breath and sharp cracks of lightning. It was at times like this when the freezing temperatures raked its claws through to your bones and sent your core to ice. When your lungs seized in shock and your mind halted and the water gave you promises of oblivion. It was times like this when you remembered that water was cold. Another crack. The world turned white. Go! Go! His ears flicked as the sound of the thunder split through his mind. His claws dug into the wood deeply, even as the weight of his sodden fur pulled him back and forth as though his own body were a traitor on the side of the water. Red eyes. Topon, you must swim away! Both moons hung high. The water was silver, so was the mast. But those eyes were red. Another crash of lightning, wings risen high. Triple bare breasts licked with rain and sea spray, feathers glistening blood red. Talons to rend flesh. I'm not leaving you, he screamed. I love you so. The crimson harpy stole those words from the stormy air. And the world went dark. Doctor's College, Third Ring, Ruslock. The nightmare had repeated. Every night the same waves. Every night the same cold. Every morning he'd rise screaming, reaching out into the darkness before the sun had even risen, trying to grasp at his father, trying to save him. And every night and every morning he'd feel his failure. 3 weeks since the event. 3 weeks of tormented nights. His reflection in the mirror barely looked like him. Felin didn't get the hollow eyes of humans, but their fur could lose its luster, his ears could droop, and any fellow Felin would look at him in pity for how sullen he'd become. Not that any humans would notice the changes. He'd barely been asked, "How are you?" except by the nurse a few times during his recovery. Chasing away the thoughts, he gathered himself for the day. Dressing in his best, he made sure his fur was smooth and his ears were at a respectful medium height. He needed to give the best impression today. The clock said it was approaching 10, so he had little more than an hour before the meeting. Moving over to a trunk at the foot of his bed, he opened it and fished out the folded blue flag he'd stored there for safety. His fingers ran over its silvered designs before lifting it free and heading to the door. The college was beautiful. Ruslock was a gorgeous city that enjoyed high-rising towers that stretched from the lower ring, rising into the upper. The city was a grand port, separated into a half-ring system that rose in semicircles towards the outer edges, higher and higher by 4 layers, giving the appearance of a city made of giant steps, the grandest step of which was the castle that stood atop the 4th, claimed by the then King Dalen. The Doctor's College was on the 3rd ring, along with the other colleges, Wayman's, Courtesans, the Merchants' College, and below the entrance to the 4th ring, housed in a large red building, were the Raviston Governing Council. He passed the council on his way, his hands levelly holding the flag as though it were a hot plate. Everyone who saw him made way, their brows rising at first until a solemn expression reached their eyes. Everyone knew what the flag meant. There was no need for the humans to read his expression nor try to notice the signs that he had barely slept for 3 weeks. The flag said it all, and the sudden outpouring of sympathy almost made him choke. Entering the Doctor's College, the corridors were filled with humans. He wasn't the only Felin in the guild, and Felins weren't uncommon in the Isles. Quite the contrary, their settlements had been in the archipelago long before the humans had colonized their way into every corner. But there was something to be said about the rate at which humans bred, and how quickly their population could explode, and not many Felins took the call to be a doctor. As such, he didn't meet a single other Felin on his journey through to the antechamber. The seated cushions gave way comfortably underneath him, his tail flicking around its legs. The room was a comfortable waiting room. Glass cabinets stood at the four corners, harboring various trinkets of value from different lands, and one of the walls was filled end to end with books. The carpet below was a patch of intricate blue designs, flowing with silver. Silver and blue, the coloration reflected in the doctor's coat he wore around his shoulders. The hushed whispers met his ears again, and though it would be seen as bad manners, he couldn't help but rise in ear to the open door, the words coming into sharp focus. "Died? That's what I heard. At college change, I think they shouldn't give the title to such people. Careful, he might be listening." His ears flipped down, facing the floor once again. The voices immediately became indistinct. He'd been anticipating this meeting with the Doctor's Council for the last week, but now he was here. He found his fingers running together anxiously. 20 minutes later, he'd chosen to occupy himself while waiting by reading a journal on the development of sutures, when he was suddenly startled as the door to his right opened sharply and the council steward stepped through. "Master Tool Pon I rot." Each enunciation was more painful than the last. The voice, butchering his name like a steak, came from the elderly human as he gazed at the slip of paper in front of him from under half-moon spectacles. "Call me Split, please, Honourable Steward," he urged. "Ah, Master Split." The steward looked relieved at the easier-to-pronounce name. "They are ready for you now." Split, not entirely sure he was ready, put the book back in its place on the shelf and took a deep breath. Pulling on the collar of his coat anxiously, he reached down and picked up the flag once more and moved to the door. "May I please hold this burden?" the steward asked formally. His hands reached forward. Split looked down longingly at the folded flag before gently laying it in the offered outstretched hands. With his hands feeling strangely empty and uncomfortably light, Split turned towards the door as the steward opened it solemnly, and the felon took a step forward. The room beyond opened up into a wide hall. White marble pillars supported a high, decorated ceiling. Images of battles were etched into its surface, a soldier here, a naked babe there crying for its family, the blood forming a river that flowed and licked around the corpses. And through the macabre scene, figures among them were highlighted with saintly glows of blue and silver wrapping their bodies. These people tended to the wounded on both sides, the images showing dual images of each person moving between the bodies of fallen ally and enemy, ignoring the carnage around them, a neutral force for the preservation of life. These images scattered a kaleidoscope of colors over the ground, reflections from the light of the tall windows that flanked a dais in the center of the room. As if by design, these ceiling reflections created concentrated shafts of light that cast in various places, the chief of which was a large one rising from the middle of the room before the elevated dais upon which the council sat. Split stepped into it, looking up into the faces bearing down at him from their elevated bar. All 5 were shadowed to his gaze, as it was designed. The identity of the council members were known, but in centuries past they had tried to have a moat of secrecy to allow the members to speak freely without fear of reprisal outside of the chamber. But as the council had grown in power, those days had long since vanished and a more open ruling system had taken hold. Split turned his ears to them, a sign of respect in his own culture. He bowed his head in honor of the council of men and women. Each one was human. Split wondered if that was by design or happenstance.
"Please state your name."
A deep voice echoed around the room clearly. This was the voice of head councillor Grisham. "Juladadi Tulponirot," Split answered.
"Is this the name you wish for your records?"
He shook his head. "I wish to be known as Waves over Split Stone, or simply Split." He heard the scribble of pens on paper as that was noted down. "Reason for the change?" A woman's voice came from Split's left, Councillor Ravner, judging by the accent. He choked for a moment. But he'd rehearsed this. He needed to seem strong in their eyes. He couldn't tell them that hearing Tulpon said by anyone other than his father caused him great pain. So instead, he gave them the answer he thought they'd prefer. "I intend to embark at Serisport. There is a good chance there will be non-locals on the crew, and some people beyond the Isles tend to have difficulty pronouncing felon names." He was tempted to glance towards the steward nearby who had butchered his name in the antechamber, but he resisted. A few mutterings could be heard, and more scribbling of pens. Councillor Fremen to Split's left spoke next in his famously monotonous drone.
We shall now read from Statement 2b. Upon completion of external requirements, the Doctors' College of Ruslock recognizes the medical doctorate completion of Juladadi Tulponirot, hereby now referred to as Waves Over Split Stone.
The councilman continued, pronouncing Split's felon name with ease.
Tutorage was recognized under registered Dr. Joseph Carmine aboard the Paradise on the Waves, under the command of Captain Abraham Valvistus. Following the passing of Dr. Joseph Carmine, his flag and mark shall honorably be awarded to Waves Over Split Stone. Do you accept this burden?
The steward approached once more, the folded flag still in his arms. Split couldn't count how often he'd gazed at it, his eyes memorizing its patterns, the way it caught the light, every inch of its slightly frayed hem, every imperfection in the stitching, and yet, as it was offered to him once more, less than a few minutes after he'd handed it over, it nonetheless felt like he was seeing it again for the very first time. It was blue, like all doctors' flags, and striped with reflective silver strips. A swishing design of waves against a rock stood dark on the deep navy, the mark of his teacher, Dr. Carmine, a mark that he was being asked to inherit. A memory rose unbidden. "I don't have a mouse problem. What need have I for a cat?" his father's first words to him. Cat was a word Split's grandfather would have taken offence at, but Split had never minded it. So despite the remark, meeting Valvistus for the first time was a fond memory. Those blue eyes Split had found to be kind, warm, and welcoming. They were the eyes of the man that would become his father, adopted into his family in all ways except blood and title. Valvistus had taught him the way of sailing, how to read the stars, and introduced him to waymen of many a port. His father had taught him the joys of music, and together they had danced and sung into the night, and they had laughed. How they had laughed! And in his mind he heard other laughter. Dr. Carmine, his master and tutor. He had been a large man, fingers fat as sausages, and yet deft with a scalpel and kindly of bed manner. Two men, not of the same blood, not of the same home, not even of the same species, yet one had become his father, and the other had become his teacher. And now they were gone. A tear slipped down his cheek before he offered his arms, and the flag was ceremoniously placed into his own. It was done. It was his now. It would be updated in the registry, and that would be circulated through every council house, every doctor's college, and every wayman's books in the Isles. No longer his mentor's symbol, his own. Swallowing the lump in his throat, he turned respectfully to the council once more, the flag a weighted burden in his arms, but a welcome one.
I do.
His quiet voice was amplified by the room.
Waves over split stone.
Split looked up from the cloth flag in his hands, back up to the bar, giving them his full attention.
The matter regarding the nature of Dr. Carmine's passing, and that of your Captain Valvistus. You have applied for the right of silver stone. It is granted. Go forth with our blessings, deliver justice, and may the gods smile upon you.
The steward offered him a sealed letter. The wax was silver, etched with the doctor's council mark, his right of silver stone. Waves over split stone bowed deeply to the council men and women, and as he was dismissed, he turned, and with flag and stone in hand, left the room.